Howdy folks, welcome back to War Thunder Ground Forces with the mighty Jingles. This is TigrisShark and he is driving a PzKpfw VI Tiger, German heavy tank, in a simulator battle on the Carpathians map. And while he's busy making the enemy team look like amateurs, we're going to be talking about the development and use of the Tiger tank. There are certain combat vehicles in World War II that had fearsome reputations, but a lot of the time the reputation was overblown out of all proportion to the actual combat performance of the vehicle. You could argue the case that this description applied to the Tiger as well, but that's only because the Tiger's reputation was so fearsome that it would have been practically impossible for the real machine to match up to it. As it is, the Tiger almost did. The Tiger was easily capable of killing any Allied vehicle that it was likely to face on a World War II battlefield. By contrast, there were very few machines that the Allies were capable of fielding that could say the same about their chances against the Tiger. When the Tiger first went into combat, the main guns of the overwhelming majority of Allied tanks that this thing was going into battle against just could not penetrate it from the front at any distance. Even dedicated Allied anti-tank guns like the American 3-inch gun or the Russian 57mm just could not handle the frontal armour of this tank. Of course, this kind of performance comes at a price, and financially, each one of these tanks cost $250,000 to construct. And a lot has been made about the poor reliability of the Tiger, especially compared to the ruggedness and dependability of, for example, the M4 Sherman or the T-34. In actual fact, the Tiger was a mechanically reliable tank, providing certain conditions were met. First of all, it needed a lot of maintenance, and secondly, it had to have an experienced and well-trained crew, particularly the commander and the driver. Because of the extreme weight of the tank, it weighed 60 tons. The power output of the engine wasn't the problem, the weakness was the suspension and the transmission. And experienced drivers never ran the engine except under the most extreme of circumstances at anything over 2,600 RPM, nowhere near the 3,000 RPM that the engine was actually capable of producing. Again, due to the weight of the tank, and also partially because of the way the suspension was designed with interleaving road wheels, the commander also had to know what he was doing and be very careful to only actually deploy the tank on ground that it was capable of fighting on. There were numerous instances of Tigers that threw their tracks after getting bogged down in thick mud, purely because of the either desperation or inexperience of the tank commander. And it was for this reason that Tigers mostly operated, at least in pairs, after they'd lost their first few Tigers due to becoming bogged down in soft terrain. While the tank itself was still in perfect fighting condition, they just couldn't retrieve it. And there weren't that many tractors or prime movers in the German army's arsenal that could safely, under fire, get forward, hitch up one of these 60-ton monsters and then drag it clear. And so Tigers would always operate at least in pairs, so that if one Tiger was immobilised, the other one, even under fire, with relative safety, could recover it and tow it back to friendly lines, where the suspension could be repaired. Development of the Tiger actually began as early as 1939. And after the fall of France, it was recognised that the German army was going to need a bigger, more heavily armed and more heavily armoured tank after encounters with French cavalry tanks like the Saumur S-39 and French heavy tanks like the Char B-1. Although this requirement wasn't taken too seriously until the German army had a very, very nasty surprise when they ran into large numbers of T-34s and KV-1s during Operation Barbarossa in 1941. No gun in German service other than the Flak 88 could penetrate the T-34 from the front. 50mm armed Panzer IIIs could penetrate a T-34 from the side, but they had to get close. And only the long 88mm flak gun could penetrate the KV-1 from any angle. The German army was horrified. In response to this, the German army called for development of a new heavy tank that could beat anything that the Russians were fielding. Porsche and Henschel, who had already been working on designs for a heavy tank in order to meet this anticipated design need, submitted prototypes for evaluation. Both designs used the Krupp turret and the KWK-36 88mm gun, a development of the infamous 88mm flat gun. Where the two designs differed was in their power plant and their transmission. The Porsche design was revolutionary, a little too revolutionary. The hybrid gasoline-electric power plant and the transmission had an annoying habit of bursting into flames at high revolutions. The Henschel design, by contrast, was considered to be easier to mass produce. Not easy to mass produce, not by any standards. The Tiger had a well-deserved reputation for being ridiculously over-engineered, but easier to mass produce than the Porsche design, and so Henschel won the contract, and the Tiger that we all know today went into production. The Henschel Tiger was an incredibly well-armoured machine for the time. The front of the turret was 120mm thick, the front of the hull 100mm thick, the sides and rear up to 80mm thick. What this meant in practice was that the overwhelming majority of Allied armour could not penetrate the Tiger from the front at any range and had to close to suicidally short ranges in order to penetrate the Tiger from the side or rear. The T-34's 76.2mm gun couldn't penetrate the Tiger from the front. The M4 Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate the Tiger from the front. If the T-34 crew were lucky enough to have some armour-piercing composite rigid ammunition, they could penetrate the side of the Tiger from 500 metres. The M4 Sherman, by contrast, with its 75mm M3 gun, could only hope to achieve a side penetration on the Tiger from a range of 100 metres. The British and the Russians, who had been closely following the development of German armour and had anticipated a need for a gun that could penetrate this kind of armour, caught on relatively quickly with the introduction of the Sherman Firefly with its 17-pounder gun, which could penetrate the front of a Tiger from ranges of up to 1,000 metres, and the Russian 85mm gun mounted on the T-34, which could penetrate the front of the Tiger from anything between 200 to 500 metres. The Americans, by contrast, were very, very slow to catch on. There are a whole number of reasons as to why America was so slow to come up with something that could reliably and safely beat tanks like the Tiger and the Panther. The American tank historian Stephen Zaloga probably sums up the reasons for this best in his excellent book Armoured Thunderbolt, History of the Design, Development and Combat Use of the M4 Sherman tank. When America was gearing up for war, it was recognised that they were going to need not just better tanks, but any tanks. And so a whole host of competing designs were rushed through development, production and evaluation, most of them terrible, at vast cost and a huge waste of resources. In order to try to get a handle on this, the head of the US Army Ground Forces, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, laid down two principal criteria for all future Army weapons: battle worthiness and battle need. Battle worthiness meant that the weapons had to be both combat effective and durable. Because the troops were going to be fighting 3,000 miles or more from the arms factories, the weapons had to be well tested in advance so that they didn't need frequent repair or replacement. There was no sense in shipping a tank 3,000 miles only to have it break down after a few hundred miles of travel. General McNair's other criteria, battle need, sounds like a very sensible requirement, basically insisting that weapons are accepted for production only if they're really needed. He wanted to avoid Army Ordnance's terrible reputation for being a bunch of mad scientists, with every engineer and design team coming up with harebrained schemes for war-winning wonder weapons. Some of the ideas were good, most of them were rubbish. In order to clamp down on ordnance, McNair instituted the following process. The armoured force or the infantry would inform ordnance of their requirements. Ordnance would then try to develop a weapon to satisfy the need. The final decision would then be taken by Army Ground Forces, General McNair himself. It all sounded perfectly reasonable, but there was a problem. Modern weapons like tanks or anti-tank guns take time to develop, months, if not years. So there cannot be a fast response to a sudden technological crisis in the theatre of battle, such as the appearance of a new tank, like the Tiger. By contrast, whereas Britain and Russia looked at the intelligence available from the battlefield at what the Germans had, and then based their designs on anticipating what the Germans were going to be coming up with next, America was always in a position of reacting to whatever Germany was using at the time, without anticipating what they were going to need in the future. Because none of the commanders on the ground were saying they needed anything better, the US Army Ordnance Department wasn't designing anything better. And even when the Panthers and the Tigers were appearing on the battlefield in appreciable numbers, not all of the armoured force commanders were saying that they actually needed anything better than the Sherman. Contrary to popular belief, the overwhelming majority of armoured division commanders were entirely happy with the performance of the M4 Sherman tank. And because of the way America employed its tanks on the battlefield, you could make the case that they were entirely correct in saying so. It wasn't the job of an American tank division to break through the enemy lines. That was the job of the infantry divisions. The tank divisions were there to exploit the breakthroughs, pour through the lines, and push on into enemy territory. There were two main reasons as to why the American doctrine was to use their tanks in this fashion. First and foremost was that a large number of the American armoured force commanders had graduated from the cavalry schools, people like General George S. Patton. And so their thinking was dominated by the use of cavalry tactics. If you're going to use your tanks in this kind of fashion, then reliability and mobility are what's important, not armour thickness or firepower. The second reason as to why American tanks like the M4 Sherman were so slow to be developed into anything that could form any kind of credible opposition to tanks like the Tiger and the Panther was because there was a very powerful and influential lobby within the US Army arguing strongly for the creation of the tank destroyer force. Whereas the armoured force was dominated by the thinking of the cavalry officers, the tank destroyer centre was dominated by artillery officers, especially General Leslie McNair, the head of Army Ground Forces, who would always have the final decision. The first head of the Tank Destroyer Centre was Colonel Andrew Bruce, and he became obsessed with mobility at the expense of all else. To be fair to the guys who were the champions of the whole tank destroyer concept, what they were proposing was perfectly in tune with the way the US Army intended to use its tanks in the first place. Tanks were not there to fight tanks, according to the US Army. Anti-tank units were there to fight tanks. Unfortunately, the German army just kept refusing to cooperate and kept sending its Panthers and Tigers against the M4s. The situation was probably best summed up by General Jacob Devers, the head of the armoured force, who visited Tunisia in 1943 to study lessons learned from the North African campaign. He basically came back saying that the best enemy of the tank is another better tank. His report on the tank destroyer force in Tunisia was particularly condemning. He said, "The separate tank destroyer arm is not a practical concept on the battlefield. Defensive anti-tank weapons are essentially artillery. Offensively, the weapon to beat a tank is a better tank. Sooner or later, the issue between ground forces is settled in an armoured battle, tank against tank. The concept of tank destroyer groups and brigades attempting to overcome equal numbers of hostile tanks is faulty unless the tank destroyers are actually better tanks than those of the enemy." General Leslie McNair, the head of Army Ground Forces and the man who had the final say on the subject, didn't agree. And yet, despite all of the arguments for and against the whole situation, it's difficult to condemn people like General Leslie McNair too much because they won. The M4 Sherman did do the job that it was supposed to do. And the Germans were never able to field Tigers and Panthers in large numbers. They still overwhelmingly relied on tanks like the Panzer IV with the long 75mm gun, which was entirely capable as well of defeating any Allied armour, and large numbers of expertly sighted and crewed towed 75mm anti-tank guns. None of which, of course, was any consolation whatsoever to Allied tank crews when they did come across Tigers in battle. The first use of the Tiger in battle was on the 23rd of September 1942 near Leningrad. Luckily for the Russians, a number of factors conspired to make this a less than auspicious first use in combat of the Tiger tank. First and foremost, it wasn't ready. The Tiger at the time was still essentially a prototype and was rushed into battle before it was finished. Secondly, the terrain on which the Tiger was used around Leningrad was very swampy and marshy, and lots of them were lost due to being bogged down in the ground. General Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg tactic, was absolutely disgusted with the decision to employ Tigers near Leningrad. He was a lot more impressed with the results that the Tigers achieved when they were deployed to Tunisia as part of the Afrika Korps, the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, and before you get too carried away by the sound of that, it only consisted initially of 3 Tigers and half a dozen Panzer IIIs and was later reinforced with 3 more Tigers, enjoyed success out of all proportion to the number of tanks they had when employed against the Allies in North Africa. Due to all of the reasons that we've already discussed, the Americans were slow on the uptake. They really didn't take the introduction of the Tiger seriously enough. Also, let's not forget that because the Tiger's 88mm KWK-36 gun was capable of hitting and killing targets from such extreme ranges, it wasn't always obvious that you were being attacked by a new tank that you'd never seen before. In some cases where it was actually the small number of Tigers that were actually operational in Tunisia that were responsible for devastating American armoured columns, the losses were attributed to towed 75mm anti-tank guns, a situation that would be completely reversed once the Allies landed in Normandy in 1944. Probably the most infamous and influential example of this would have been the action that took place on the morning of the 13th of June 1944 at the village of Villers-Bocage as part of the overall attack on the city of Caen. An armoured column of the British 22nd Armoured Brigade was advancing from the village toward Caen along the road when they were ambushed by a couple of Tiger I tanks of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann. Wittmann wrote that he'd actually been surprised by the British advance through the village. He said, "I had no time to assemble my company. Instead, I had to act quickly, as I had to assume that the enemy had already spotted me and would destroy me where I stood. I set off with one tank and passed the order to the others not to retreat a single step, but to hold their ground. His tank was spotted at around about 0900 by Sergeant O'Connor of the Rifle Brigade, who is alleged to have shouted, 'For Christ's sake, get a move on, there's a Tiger running alongside us 50 yards away.' The next warning that the British received was when they started losing tanks. Wittmann's first shot knocked out the Cromwell tank at the rear of the column, blocking off their retreat. His next shot disabled and set on fire a Sherman Firefly at the front of the column. Two more Tigers from Wittmann's tank company then arrived at the rear of the column and started taking British tanks under fire, while Wittmann quite calmly drove along the length of the column with machine guns and high explosive rounds and started knocking out vehicles one by one, all the while under fire from a British 6-pounder anti-tank gun and handheld Piat anti-tank weapons which were completely ineffective. By the time he'd finished dealing with the column, he then turned and moved into the town in search of other British tanks. Once he arrived at the east end of Villers-Bocage, he engaged and knocked out 3 M5 Stuart light tanks. In the town, the regimental headquarters group was trying to escape while reversing, but their reverse speed was painfully slow, and one tank managed to fire 2 shots, completely ineffectively, before being knocked out by Wittmann's Tiger. 2 remaining tanks reversed off the road into the gardens of the houses in the village. Captain Pat Dias, the adjutant of the regiment, parked his tank behind a barn. Wittmann's Tiger drove past, completely ignoring him, knocking out one other tank. Lieutenant Charles Pierce then took his scout car and tried to warn the rest of the reconnaissance troop in the town centre that Tigers were on the way. Wittmann, meanwhile, had knocked out another Cromwell and on the main street knocked out 2 artillery observation post tanks of the 5th Royal Horse Artillery, the intelligence officer's scout car and a medical officer's half-track. At this point, Wittmann was engaged by a Sherman Firefly, which hit the driver's vision port and dented it, forcing him to withdraw through a house that collapsed. Meanwhile, Captain Dias had been stalking Wittmann's Tiger, managed to get round behind him in his Cromwell, and fired point blank into the rear of Wittmann's Tiger. It had absolutely no effect. You can probably imagine the horror that Captain Dias and his tank crew were experiencing as Wittmann quite calmly turned the turret of the Tiger around and, firing over the back of the tank, knocked out his Cromwell with 1 shot. Dias managed to escape the wreckage of the tank and did eventually survive the war. Wittmann then withdrew from the town, where he was eventually disabled and forced to abandon his Tiger by fire from a 6-pounder anti-tank gun which immobilised his tank. In marked contrast to the situation in Tunisia, it didn't take many circumstances like this before Major Christopher W. Wilbeck noted in his study of German heavy tank battalions that whenever a German tank appeared, regardless of type, Allied army units continually reported that Tiger tanks were in their sector, or that they had destroyed Tiger tanks. Such was the fearsome reputation of this tank, and the kind of fear that it inspired in anybody who even suspected that one or more of them were operating in their sector. Wittmann didn't survive the war, but claimed 138 tanks killed in his Tiger. Johannes Bolter, 139 or more, Otto Karius 150 or more, and Kirk Nispel 168 vehicle kills. Numerous Tiger commanders claimed over 100 kills each. Luckily for the world as we know it today, while a properly maintained, supplied Tiger equipped with an experienced and well-trained crew was a fearsome weapon out of all proportion to the numbers in which they were employed on the battlefield, there just weren't enough of them, and there were plenty of M4 Shermans and plenty of T-34s. Today, only 7 of the 1,300 Tigers that were produced still survive. Only one of them, Tiger 131 at the Bovington Tank Museum, exists in working order. If you can't get down to the Bovington Tank Museum to see Tiger 131 being put through her paces at Tankfest, you can always do the next best thing, because Tiger 131 is one of the stars of the upcoming movie Fury, starring Brad Pitt. It has the distinction of being the first time a real Tiger has appeared in any movie since World War II itself. As always, hope you enjoyed today's video, take care, and I'll catch you next time.